So, as media coverage continues and gears up ahead of the trial of Ghislaine Maxwell, there's increasing scrutiny about the language used by media outlets to describe the abuse that the alleged victims say that they suffered under the hands of Ghislaine Maxwell and convicted sex offender Jeffrey Epstein. Now, I want to say that Ghislaine Maxwell has denied all the charges and that she has pled not guilty. But we want to talk about the way this trial and these cases have been covered. It's something that was discussed in an article that was published last year from Jen by Medium, which says that the media is, quote, using all the wrong words. So Andrea Gonzalez-Ramirez is a senior writer for Jen by Medium and wrote that article and is joining us now to talk about the lasting impact of how we frame these conversations and the impact it can have on survivors, and also just how society sort of handles these sort of issues. So thank you so much for joining us. The article was really good. I began reading it thinking it would be an article about someone else, some other news outlet, because I feel like we are sensitive to the needs of these victims. And then I really found myself asking myself, have I used some of these phrases? Sometimes it's just in an attempt to not say alleged victim over and over again or something. So then you throw in different language, but that creates an impression about the nature of the crimes that are being alleged here. So let me ask you first, what are some of the words being used by news outlets that you think are changing the characterization of the crime?
Yeah, thank you for having me, Anne-Marie. I think the first thing that we've seen over the last year and a half, where we've seen reporting around Epstein, his arrest, his death, and now Ghislaine Maxwell, is the term underage women. That in itself is an oxymoron, right? When we talk about their alleged victims, these were young girls. Like, you cannot be underage and a woman. So that's the first thing. We've seen other things also, like, perform oral sex instead of forced to perform oral sex, or falling into Epstein's web to describe the process in which his victims were groomed by him. So I think that a lot of times, as you say, when we try, to be as accurate as we can because of the law, and we don't want to misrepresent something, because in this country everyone is deemed innocent until proven otherwise. We kind of sanitize the language a little bit, and that in the end is very harmful to victims and very harmful to the public that then doesn't know how to, characterize what's going on with a lot of these cases.
Yeah, it's funny, even the phrase falling into a web suggests that you were a victim was, in a way, a little bit gullible, was, sort of able to fall for something. And you also talk about how there is some subtle framing that suggests that the interactions were consensual. And I'm sure when people read about what the victims have said about what had happened to them, what they're alleging had happened to them, they're going to hear about private flights on private planes and going to private islands and beaches and cabanas. And there's an implied consent in some of these conversations, and that can be harmful, not just when talking about this case, but talking about the issue of sexual violence and sexual violations in a broad sense.
Yeah, absolutely. So the first thing we need to say is that Epstein victims were young girls that were extremely marginalized. A lot of them came from abusive homes where there was drug addiction. They're near homelessness or near homelessness. So to begin, these were girls who society kind of does not pay attention to begin with. So obviously, when you describe that, and then you describe the incredible wealth this man allegedly had, their question is well, really, these girls were getting paid to give this massage? Were they actually, were they really not kind of willing participants? But they were not, because they were children. And, you have to put themselves in their shoes. We both were teenage girls at some point. So we cannot really make those type of decisions. Like your brain is not fully developed at that point. And if you add to that that you live at the margins, and then you're exposed to this incredible wealth, you're gonna feel like you cannot really say no, because otherwise this man is super powerful. What is gonna happen to you? And when describing what happened to these victims, including all that context, is crucial. And I feel sometimes we as the media, we failed at that.
Yeah, I think that there is an idea that coercion needs to look violent somehow,
Hmm.
and so if
Hmm.
it doesn't, then that word, people tend to shy away from that word. But what you're describing is a type of coercion that is probably more likely to be implemented by traffickers
Hmm.
than the other stuff that we see in movies.
Hmm. Yeah, I think that as a society, we have this idea that rape only takes place when some stranger grabs you during the night and pulls you into an alley and like just pulls a knife out and tells you like, shut up, I'll rape you or otherwise you're gonna die. And that's not
Hmm.
the reality. We've seen that in cases of kids specifically, 90% of child sexual abuse it's performed by people they know. So they're being abused by people like in their immediate circles. These are not strangers. And the same way, like with this type of coercion that we saw with Epstein and his victims, it was very similar, right? He developed a relationship with them, right? Like he promised them things, they promised him money. He helped some of them get into college and through that exploited them. And we cannot really erase that context and the fact that it was coercion. They could not voluntarily consent to this. First, because they were kids, and second, because there was an inherent imbalance of power between them and this like man and his enablers.
Hmm. And when you listen to some of Jeffrey Epstein's alleged victims, they talk about their reluctance to come forward because the process of coming forward was traumatizing to them. The language that we use in the media to tell the story, can that also traumatize them?
Yeah, of course. When you experience sexual violence in any capacity, and then you read about your story in the newspaper, or you hear people discussing your case on TV and whatnot, that can be very triggering. But the language that we use to sanitize those experiences and kind of hide the gross harm that these people suffer can be also traumatizing to those victims. And in many ways can also lead the public to be like, well, maybe they're not as sympathetic, right? Maybe they kind of like
Mm.
wanted it, or maybe they just like benefited from it, and now they're crying like, that they were harmed. So in that sense, we have a responsibility, to educate the public, but also be fair and just to these victims who are in extremely brave coming forward to talk about like the worst moment in their lives.
Hmm. And so we're talking about this very, very high profile case, right? There's lots of news coverage, documentaries made about it, but you make it a point in your article to really underline the fact that, women are being abused all over the place. There are no cameras, there are no journalists telling their story. And so the language that we use is not just about this high profile case and these victims, it's about the victims that go, that fly under the radar and
Mhm.
how they feel about themselves, how they feel about how law enforcement interacts with them. And that's why it's important not just to change the language that we use publicly in the media, but to change the language overall.
Yeah, of course. According to the CDC, 1 in 3 women will experience sexual violence over their lifetimes, and 1 in 4 men. So a lot of people know and love others who've been victims of sexual violence. And this language that we use is important. I think a lot about, for example, the way that we portray when a teacher abuses their student, especially when the teacher is
Mm.
female and the student is male. The way that is often portrayed like it's an affair, they fell in love, and that's not real, right? Like this was a child that was groomed by a predator, and we should be clear in the way that we talk about these cases because we owe it to so many people out there who are victims of sexual violence and who deserve much better than the way that we're talking about it right now.
Very good. Really, really interesting article. You made me think, so I'm sure you're going to make a lot of other people think. Andrea Gonzalez-Ramirez, thank you so much.
Thank you.